Standing next to the President of the United States, on Turkish soil, at a NATO summit hosted in his own capital, Recep Tayyip Erdogan just got something he's wanted for 6 straight years. And he got it while the leader of Israel was on the phone begging for the exact opposite outcome just days earlier. That's not spin. That's the actual sequence of events that just played out in Ankara. And it might be the clearest sign yet that the balance of power in the Middle East is quietly tilting toward a country most people haven't been paying nearly enough attention to. So stick with me for the next 30 minutes, because I'm going to walk you through exactly how Turkey pulled off this diplomatic win, why the F-35 jet at the center of it all matters so much more than it sounds, how Erdogan positioned himself as Washington's newest indispensable partner in the region, and why Israel, for the first time in a long time, is finding itself on the losing side of an argument with its most important ally. Let's start right where this story actually peaked, at the NATO summit in Ankara this past week. President Trump traveled to Turkey, stood shoulder to shoulder with Erdogan at a joint press appearance, and when a reporter asked him directly about selling F-35 fighter jets to Turkey, Trump didn't hedge. He said the United States would consider it. And then he said something that landed like a small earthquake back in Jerusalem. He said America has a better relationship with Turkey now, and that Turkey has, in his own words, been in many ways much more loyal than other countries. Sit with that phrase for a second. More loyal than other countries. Trump didn't name names, but in a region where Israel has spent decades positioning itself as America's one truly reliable partner, that comment was almost impossible not to read as a direct public downgrade of that special status, delivered casually, standing next to the one leader in the region who has spent years calling for Israel's destruction. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to go back 6 years, to when this entire saga actually started. Turkey used to be part of the F-35 program. It was building components for the jet, training pilots to fly it, fully integrated into one of the most advanced military manufacturing partnerships in the world. Then, during Trump's first term, Turkey went ahead and purchased Russia's S-400 air defense system, a move Washington considered such a serious security risk that it removed Turkey from the F-35 program entirely. The concern was straightforward. If Turkey operated both the S-400 and the F-35 in the same airspace, Russian engineers could potentially gather intelligence on exactly what makes the F-35 nearly invisible to radar, undermining the jet's biggest advantage for every other country flying it, including Israel. Turkey got locked out, and it stayed locked out for years, developing its own domestic fighter jet program instead, called the Khan, largely out of necessity rather than choice. Fast forward to this year, and the door that's been closed since that first Trump term appears to be swinging back open, and it's happening on 2 fronts at once. First, there's the matter of engines. Turkey's Khan fighter still depends on American-made F-110 jet engines to actually fly, and Reuters reported last month that the Trump administration had formally notified Congress of its intention to sell more than $700 million worth of those engines to Turkey. Second, and far more significant, there's the question of Turkey getting fully readmitted to the F-35 program itself, buying the actual aircraft outright rather than just components for its own separate jet. When Trump was asked last month whether he was moving forward on both fronts, he didn't dance around it. He said he thought so, and added that he was probably going to do something that would make Erdogan very happy. That single sentence tells you almost everything about how this White House is currently thinking about Turkey. Not as a difficult NATO member to be managed cautiously. Not as a country still facing lingering suspicion over its Russian weapons purchases. But as a partner Trump is actively looking for ways to reward. And Erdogan, for his part, has been working hard to earn exactly that kind of trust, at least in Washington's eyes, even while continuing to say things about Israel that would be considered disqualifying in almost any other diplomatic relationship. This is the part of the story that makes Turkey's rising position genuinely fascinating to watch. Less than 2 weeks before standing next to Trump in Ankara, Erdogan had publicly called on God to destroy what he referred to as Zionist Israel. That's an extraordinary thing to say about a country the United States considers one of its closest allies, and yet it appears to have had essentially zero impact on Washington's willingness to move forward with a major weapons deal just days later. When Israeli and Greek leaders raised objections to the F-35 sale, Erdogan responded not with diplomatic caution, but with something closer to a lecture, saying any problem people have with Turkey can be solved as long as everyone involved is reasonable. Coming from a leader who had just called for Israel's destruction, telling Israel to be reasonable is a genuinely bold move, and the fact that it doesn't seem to have cost him anything with the Trump administration tells you just how much leverage Turkey currently has in this relationship. So where is that leverage actually coming from? This is the question worth digging into, because Turkey's rising status isn't happening in a vacuum. It's built on Ankara making itself genuinely useful to Washington in ways that go well beyond military hardware. According to Galia Lindenstrauss, a senior research fellow at Israel's own Institute for National Security Studies, there's a growing narrative forming around Erdogan specifically as a leader who can, in her words, bring the goods, meaning someone capable of delivering real, tangible results rather than empty promises. And Turkey has receipts to back that reputation up. Ankara played a key role as a mediator between Israel and Hamas, particularly during the negotiations tied to the Trump-backed deal that ultimately secured the release of the final Israeli hostages held in Gaza. According to Tom Barrack, who serves as both the U.S. Special Envoy on Syria and the American ambassador to Turkey, Trump personally called Erdogan just hours before the Gaza ceasefire was finalized back in October, specifically asking him to help bring two senior Hamas leaders on board with the agreement. When the President of the United States is dialing Erdogan directly during the most sensitive hours of a hostage negotiation, that's not a relationship built on sentiment. That's a relationship built on results. Turkey's growing footprint doesn't stop there either. It's also become a central player in managing tensions inside Syria, with coordination mechanisms involving Turkey helping prevent unwanted escalation in that country, even as multiple other regional actors, including Israel, continue operating there as well. Hosting this year's NATO summit in Ankara was itself a symbolic milestone, a visible marker of Turkey positioning itself at the center of major Western security discussions rather than sitting on the periphery, treated with suspicion because of its earlier purchase of Russian weapons systems. According to Nimrod Gorin, who heads an Israeli research institute called Mitvim, focused on regional foreign policy, that symbolism says something real about Turkey's rising status in the region, even as Israel, in his own assessment, appears to be trending in the opposite direction. Now let's bring Israel's side of this into the picture, because up until this point, we've mostly been looking at Turkey's ascent from Turkey's side of the ledger. Just days before Trump's comments in Ankara, Prime Minister Netanyahu had personally called Trump and urged him not to sell Turkey new jet engines or allow Ankara back into the F-35 program at all. He didn't stop at a private phone call either. He went on both Fox News and CNN within the same week, making his case directly to the American public. His argument centered on one core idea: that Israeli air superiority has functioned as the guarantee underpinning the entire regional balance of power for years, and that handing Turkey access to the same advanced stealth technology Israel has relied on would meaningfully erode that advantage. He described Erdogan in blunt terms across multiple interviews, calling him a leader who openly calls for Israel's annihilation, occupies half of Cyprus, threatens Greece, and talks about conquering Jerusalem. He characterized the current Turkish government as a regime infected by the Muslim Brotherhood, language he's used consistently in nearly every interview he's given on this topic. And yet, despite all of that, despite a direct personal appeal from the Prime Minister of one of America's closest allies, Trump appears to be moving forward anyway. That's the real headline buried inside this story. It's not really about F-35 jets. It's about what happens when Israel makes its case as forcefully as it possibly can, using every available channel: private diplomacy, public interviews, direct personal appeals, and the outcome still doesn't go its way. For a country that has spent decades assuming its concerns would carry outsized weight in Washington, that's a genuinely uncomfortable data point. Netanyahu, to his credit, has been careful in how he's handled the optics of this disagreement. In both of his television interviews, he went out of his way to insist there's no real rift between himself and Trump, describing the two leaders as seeing eye to eye on the big issues, and framing this specifically as the kind of disagreement that happens between close allies from time to time. When asked about comments Trump made suggesting some tension between them, including a remark that Netanyahu knows who the boss is, Netanyahu brushed it off entirely, saying simply that the president has his own way of expressing things, and so does he. It's a delicate needle to thread, sounding the alarm as loudly as possible on American television about what he clearly views as a serious strategic threat, while simultaneously reassuring everyone watching that the broader alliance remains completely intact. But here's the thing about that balancing act. It only works if the underlying relationship actually holds steady. And there are signs suggesting Israel is navigating more friction points with Washington right now than just this one. The current ceasefire between the United States and Iran, which Netanyahu was pushing to continue fighting through rather than end, notably left several of Israel's core security concerns unresolved, including Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile production, and its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Netanyahu has been notably restrained in his public criticism of that deal, saying it's too early to know how it will play out, and that he believes Trump deserves the chance to try negotiation, even while admitting he personally has his doubts. There's also been a well-documented and widely reported softening of support for Israel among segments of the Democratic Party in the United States, along with growing American attention on settler violence in the West Bank, an issue Netanyahu addressed directly in his CNN interview, describing certain incidents as being carried out by roughly 150 what he called juvenile delinquents, while acknowledging the broader issue has, in his words, blown up beyond belief. Put all of these threads together, and you get a picture of an Israeli government managing several simultaneous points of friction with its most important ally, at exactly the same moment that a regional rival is actively consolidating a stronger, more central position in Washington's strategic thinking. None of this means the U.S.-Israel relationship is collapsing. Both leaders have repeatedly emphasized how closely aligned they remain on the issues they consider most important. But it does suggest something worth paying attention to: a subtle but real shift in how much automatic deference Israel's specific objections currently carry inside the Trump administration's broader regional calculations, especially when weighed against what Turkey now brings to the table. It's also worth noting that despite all the public tension, Turkey and Israel haven't fully severed practical cooperation behind the scenes, even amid all this rhetorical hostility. According to reporting from the Times of Israel, intelligence coordination between the two countries continues, and a mechanism specifically designed to prevent unwanted military escalation in Syria still appears to be functioning as intended. Decades of quiet business ties between Turkish and Israeli companies also remain active, operating well below the public radar, even as their governments trade increasingly sharp accusations on television. Ambassador Barak has reportedly said he's actively working to improve relations between Ankara and Jerusalem, suggesting Washington still sees genuine value in eventually smoothing over this relationship, rather than allowing it to permanently harden into open hostility. So what does all of this actually tell us about where things are headed? If Turkey does end up securing both the engines it needs for its domestic Khan fighter program and renewed access to purchase the F-35 outright, that represents a real, measurable shift in the regional balance of air power, one that Israeli security planners have spent years working to prevent, specifically because it chips away at the kind of unquestioned air dominance that has underpinned Israel's broader security strategy for decades. And the way this played out, Turkey rising through demonstrated usefulness and results, Israel objecting loudly through every available channel and still coming up short, tells you something important about how alliances actually function in practice. They're not just about history, shared values, or decades of goodwill. They're constantly being renegotiated based on who's delivering results for Washington's interests in the moment. And right now, it looks like Turkey is delivering in ways that are hard for the Trump administration to ignore, regardless of how loudly Israel objects. Here's where this leaves us right now, as you're watching this video. Trump has signaled clear openness to moving forward with both the engine sale and Turkey's full readmission to the F-35 program. Netanyahu has made his objections about as loudly and publicly as any Israeli prime minister realistically can without triggering an open diplomatic rupture with Washington. And Erdogan, having positioned himself as an indispensable mediator across Gaza, Syria, and now NATO's own regional security architecture, appears to be reaping the benefits of that positioning in real time, standing next to the President of the United States and hearing himself described as more loyal than other countries. Whether this becomes a lasting shift in how Washington weighs its relationships across the Middle East, or just a temporary friction point that gets smoothed over the way so many past disagreements between allies eventually do, is something we're only going to be able to answer by watching exactly how this triangle between Washington, Ankara, and Jerusalem continues to evolve. I want to know what you think about all of this. Do you think Turkey's rising status in Washington is a real, lasting shift in the region's balance of power? Or do you think Israel's objections eventually slow this deal down or change its terms before anything actually gets finalized? Let me know your take in the comments because I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of conversation I want happening on this channel. And if this video helped you see a side of this story that most headlines are only covering in fragments, share it with someone who's been trying to keep up with everything happening between Turkey, Israel, and the United States right now. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I will see you in the next video as we keep following exactly how this story continues to unfold.